Right, thank you, Peter. So Peter's asked me to come in and talk around looking at how transitions in the global energy system are going to potentially flow through to the development of new applications for technologies like non-intrusive load monitoring. So I think one of the things that, if one was being critical of NILM, one could say, to a certain extent, it is a solution in search of a problem, that a lot of people are looking for really good killer applications that allow for the commercialization and uptake of disaggregation technologies. So one of the things that I think is changing within the energy system globally is this move towards digitalisation and introduction of new technologies like distributed ledgers. This is an area that's growing very fast in my own research, and as we'll see from reference to some of the International Energy Agency reports that are just coming out, there's a big shift in this direction. And I think there are very interesting opportunities when you start to combine NILM technologies plus this digitalisation of energy along with distributed ledgers in this space. So I'm going to take you on a trip from sort of global scale macro changes in the energy system through to what that might mean for the application of NILM. And I'm going to try and speak for about 40 minutes. I've got my timer here. Academics are notoriously bad at sticking to time, so I always sort of carry my own little timer there to try and keep me vaguely on track. The other thing I'm doing, which is slightly strange, and I'll explain later, is stopping my laptop falling asleep over here as well. Right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to preface my entire argument on one slide. Having loaded that up into your brains, I'm going to then progressively kind of evidence that and unpack it. So this is an argument which is looking for benefits of NILM within the wider energy system. So the things we know about the energy system are it is in a very rapid process of change. That's being driven by reductions in the cost of renewable energy technologies and battery storage. So reports by Morgan Stanley and others, and research by the IEA, are saying that renewables will be the cheapest source of energy in most countries by 2020. So this is a fundamental change, and this applies mostly to shore-based wind and solar energy. And it's not taking the whole energy system's cost, it's looking at the cost of the per kilowatt cost of output. But renewables are intermittent, and to make them work well, we need to get better at having demand follow supply. So we're changing the system round from one which has traditionally been demand-driven to one which is supply-driven and supply-demand matching. It also means that we're going to have a lot of bidirectional energy flows over the grid, and that creates all sorts of problems because our grid was never designed to have energy flowing in both directions. That means that we have to be better at managing energy flows, and that means that organisations like distribution system operators, as we're seeing here in the UK, are now moving towards providing balancing services which are distributed out where this generation capacity is coming into the grid. If you're going to balance out at the edges of your network, then you need in some way to create balance groups. So these are subsets of generation and consumption which balance each other out. If you do that, you have much better asset utilization on your network, and you can make much better use of existing infrastructure. So part of that is, the problem is when you have these balance groups, you have a risk of these groups being out of balance. So once you have smaller balance groups, then the problem is they need to do day-ahead prediction and buy energy either directly or indirectly through an aggregator or a retailer into the wholesale market. And there's a much greater chance of them being out of balance. And when you're out of balance, then that's quite expensive to correct in the energy market. So what do you do about that? Well, to do that, what you need to do is to have much better prediction of day-ahead demand. because that's how you buy energy against the market. You need better capacity to shift that demand through demand-side response and localized storage. And you need better ways of desynchronizing demand so that demands all aren't piling up on one on top of the other and stressing the network. So here, I think, is when we get to the point where there are direct applications for forms of non-intrusive load monitoring. So disaggregation, I think, can form a really critical sensing role in determining what's going to fall through the ceiling, determining basically demand and allowing you to better understand, to build up better models of day-ahead demand. Digitalisation, which is a big thing emerging at both the IEA level and through the European Union, allows you to have non-intrusive load monitoring plus other metadata, so you can actually start to provide evidence that people have shifted demand. And technologies like distributed ledgers offer a possibility of turning that into a tradable, verifiable source of value. So there you're moving towards potentials where the combination of these can create new business models to drive uptake. So that's an overall snapshot of what we're looking at. So the values involved here are really quite considerable. So we're seeing, about 2.4 trillion of value being unlocked from the energy system transformation. I think that's important thing to note is this is creation of new value in the system through the creation of new products and services in this space, and that's World Economic Forum. Global grid parity due to the falling costs of renewables. Then we've got balancing services. For some reason the transitions aren't working. This is supposed to come up separately. So we're seeing a large chunk of additional money that will be made available, about 30 billion coming in, has been estimated, from building to grid services. And we're seeing things like electrification of vehicles. Electrification of vehicles is actually going to be, I think, a driving technology because of the rate of uptake. The other things that's worth pointing out is, if you haven't seen them, and you probably haven't, so there's reports coming out from the IEA, two that are of particular interest. One is looking at the Chinese energy system and transformations in that. This other one on the digitalisation of energy, that was not released when I left home at 8 o'clock this morning. It's just been released. They were holding back for today because of timings with the COP23. So that goes through and does the biggest review the IEA has done to date on the digitalisation of energy systems. And they've got figures like smart demand response could provide 185 gigawatts of system flexibility within the market. They say it allows for greater integration of variable renewables, which is the argument that I'm making here. So if we can better balance supply and demand at the edges of our network, we can drive in much more renewable capacity without having our network fall over. We do hit limits once we get into interseasonal storage, and we need technologies to address that as well. Smart charging technologies for electric vehicles. So, as I said, electric vehicles are going to be one of the pinch points, and the government is particularly concerned about the clustered uptake of electric vehicles in the UK, because what we will see as electric vehicles coming in, they will be quite often plugged in areas where they're actually linked onto the same phase of the network. Then you can have all sorts of problems. You can get overheating of the neutral phase, and you can get tripping out of transformers. So it doesn't take much. An electric vehicle doubles the electric load on a home, and we can see very rapid uptake. So all of these things the IEA is highlighting are really key elements that will come in with the digitalisation of energy. This is driven home by looking at World Energy Council's issues monitor. So this is a nice snapshot that they produce. Here we have a graph which is looking at the uncertainties versus the impact. And these orange dots around here are the critical uncertainties that policymakers are worrying about. And these blue dots are the ones that they're actually spending most time developing policies and programs around. One of the things that's changed is you can see these arrows, which are actually looking at where these things have changed over time. So each of these is showing since 2010 how this has moved on this graph. So digitization since 2010 has hugely moved up in prioritization, decentralized systems, renewable energies, and electric storage. These are the things that are moving very rapidly in terms of the concern of global leaders. World Energy Council, Dr. Christoph Frey is the General Secretary of that. It's worth noting this guy, he comes back later on in important contexts. So this is one of the most well-recognized bodies looking at the future of energy. This is being driven by things we probably all know. So uptake of PV is growing very, very rapidly, and that's being accompanied by falls in costs. So you can see here, this is the IEA's uptake of PV and how rapidly that's going, and you're seeing here the photovoltaic costs coming down more rapidly. As you see, fossil fuels are, if anything, going up in costs, but PV is coming down very rapidly, mostly due to work in China, which is stripping out a lot of the system costs. So the costs of the individual photovoltaic arrays and cells hasn't been coming down that rapidly, but the whole system integrated costs have been dropping very, very quickly due to expansion in China. We're also seeing increases in the efficiency of cells year by year. So that's driving up with the introduction of a whole lot of new technologies which are coming in and also dropping in costs. The IEA's Tracking Clean Energy Progress identifies only 3 technologies which are currently on track to deliver against the 2-degree goal that is set by the climate change process. So those are electric vehicles, energy storage, and solar PV and onshore wind. So those 3 technologies are the ones that are driving change and driving a process of, if you like, catching up with the technology that is going on within policy and regulatory circles. So when you combine those things together, you get back to this model of we are driving the production of our energy out towards the edge of the grid. So that is, again, we still have an awful lot of centralized generation capacity. And it was only very recently that we've now got to the point where the combination of wind and solar is now equal to the generation capacity of nuclear in the UK for the first time. That happened very recently. The one that we think will actually drive change the most is the global EV outlook. So what we're seeing there is an anticipated very rapid increase. So we've seen a doubling of electric vehicles from 1 million to 2 million in the last year, but the projections of these are for radically increased numbers. So the graph that you can see down the bottom there is where we have been to date, and that's included a doubling in the last year of numbers, and these are the projections under a range of different scenarios. Now that is hugely challenging to the energy system, and that will require us to find ways to manage these loads as they integrate in. So we will need to find ways in order to desynchronize them. So when we get clusters of EVs coming on, they're not all charging at the same point in time. We need to be able to identify and preferably come up with different charging solutions for EVs so that as you move around, you can plug them in. And there's work going on now that RWE Energy has done that we'll touch on, which is looking at different technologies for charging and for billing the applications of EV charging. Once we move from the global level to the EU level, then the EU has published its winter package. This was in 2016 and is proposed, there is a proposed 4th electricity directive. Again, it's interesting to see where the legislators are going on this. So the third directive has been around for about sort of 6 or 7 years now, and the fourth directive is still under negotiation. But the differences are really significant in terms of what it means for individual prosumers and collective prosumers. So now we're breaking it down to the level that disaggregation technologies find applications in this area. So those with the green tick at the bottom, so this is the fourth directive, is showing those areas where within the fourth electricity directive there are special measures to encourage the uptake of prosumers within the electricity market. So they're not just creating a level playing field, they're going beyond that to actively encourage uptake. So that's in production of energy, interaction with the wholesale energy market. And we're seeing that also in the UK with the introduction of half-hour settlement for consumers. So we will see the opportunity for organisations to come in and create value by settling domestic meters at a half-hourly level within the UK. And the regulator is doing a lot of work in that area and trying to make sure that doesn't disadvantage sort of vulnerable customers in the same time. But we're seeing that come in. The one notable area that we're not seeing is direct participation in the retail market as yet. There's still debate going on around whether we should allow individual consumers to participate in the retail market. This is challenging because most of the regulation structures in both the UK but in the EU are predicated on a one supplier per customer model. So currently it's not possible for an individual to have multiple suppliers simultaneously. There's now a lot of investigation and discussion by the regulator as to how that may need to be relaxed. So that then creates opportunities where people can have multiple suppliers simultaneously. That opens up the market for new business models to come in. And I think a lot of those new business models are going to need potentially the capacity to disaggregate demand beyond the meter. This EU winter package has actually knocked through into legislative changes throughout the EU. So now we're seeing changes coming in France. They've now legislated requiring their distribution system operators to permit people to consume their own energy. Previously, if you had a PV array, you had to export it to the grid at whatever the individual grid price was. Now they're actually requiring distribution system operators to allow people to consume their own energy, and there's research going on now quite a lot looking at how you can do that over private wires and virtual private wire solutions. That then opens up the space for things like peer-to-peer trading, so that then you can understand how people can swap energy in and out. So we've got projects which we've now submitted, and we're part of the Ofgem regulatory sandbox, where we're looking at situations where PV on roof can actually be traded within individual buildings. Now that's quite attractive at the moment, because currently the feed-in tariffs are quite low unless you're on a legacy tariff. So if you're currently buying energy at 15 pence per kilowatt hour off the grid, and you're only being paid 5 pence for selling it back to the grid, then it's really attractive to be able to say, well, I would actually like to sell it to my neighbour for somewhere between 5 and 15 pence. So you can start to see the construction of business models. There's a lot of work to make these economically viable, but it creates the space for innovation in this area. That will do things like drive the uptake of batteries as well as PVs, and there will be greater need to understand and predict energy demand in homes. Once we're there, then we're seeing a driver for better disaggregation and understanding of demand. So you can see how these will have progressive knock-on effects. This is also coming in Germany, and Austria are likewise changing their legislation. So we will see that cascading across Europe. In the UK systems context, so there was a speech, must be a couple of weeks ago now, by Dermot Nolan who's CEO of Ofgem. So he was talking, saying things like peer-to-peer trading is one of the most exciting new areas developing. This is really surprising coming out of the head of our regulatory regime. He's also saying that technology companies would want to bundle the energy associated with individual appliances in when they sell that appliance. And people are talking about models where they bundle in the cost of energy associated with the sale of individual products. That may be things where you could imagine hypothetically a situation where you buy your Christmas turkey and the energy to cook that is thrown in. All of these things require the capacity to disaggregate at the household level. So these things are coming through from the head of the regulatory agency in the UK. So we have a curious situation where innovation is being driven both by a lot of startup companies pushing in this space and the regulator that is looking to fundamentally change the system. Bayes and Ofgem reports talking about 17 to 40 billion of additional value that's coming in through the deployment of flexibility technologies. When you have flexibility technologies, you have to be able to predict demand and know when demand can be shifted. So you have to get inside of, or depending on your perspective, either in front of or behind the meter, depending on which side of the meter you're standing. But you need to be able to understand the loads and build models off the back of those loads. We've seen companies like LightSource come in and put together business models where they will install PV and storage in your home for free in exchange for a long-term contract for doing that. So this is, again, the driver of the reduction in costs coming in. There was also a big announcement of a £1 billion programme for the investment of PV in social housing. So again, that was driven now by the economics of the rates of return on these things. We can start to attract institutional investors at scale. There was another report basically looking at the value that can be created through the construction of new services. And I think this is an important perspective. This is not stripping out costs. This is creating new value propositions that can go into the marketplace and create value for participants and consumers. So I want to talk now a bit about distributed ledgers, because I know there is a lot of interest in this area. There is a lot of hype in this area. And I think most of you in the room will have come across this as a concept. It's always difficult to talk about because one doesn't know quite the level of knowledge of different organizations. The first caveat with distributed ledgers are that we are sitting at the peak of the Gartner hype cycle. Okay, everybody is furiously excited by these things. This will inevitably follow by that kind of trough of disillusionment as we realize we can't either implement them for a range of regulatory or technical reasons, or that the excitement around the technology can't be matched by the construction of business models to make them viable. But there are some really interesting ideas that are coming through on this, and I'll talk a bit about some of the applications that they're being put to. From the NILM community's perspective, the interesting thing about distributed ledgers is how we can actually start to encode some of the feature vectors we find within NILM into these ledgers so that we can actually then use them to create value and exchange value. So I think this will be a growing area, and there are definitely organizations within the NILM community which are moving across into this space. So Joe Ito came up with one of the best quotes around this to understand what these distributed ledgers or blockchains are. And he said that blockchain makes information look like a thing. It creates scarcity that you can't do on the internet. So the thing we know about energy is it has to be balanced and settled. If I generate a kilowatt hour of energy, I can't simultaneously sell it to two separate people. So we have to account individually for every unit of energy that gets exchanged in the system. Distributed ledgers are the digital technology that allow you to ensure that you don't have double selling or double accounting of these packets of energy as they flow around the system. So it's the same thing. The reason these came in with cryptocurrencies is because if I have a £5 note and I wanted to, give it to two people, if I went to a photocopier and photocopied that £5 note and then gave you a photocopy, you probably wouldn't be that impressed. The idea of £5 notes is that I exchange it with you and I have £5 less and you have £5 more. The problem with a lot of digital assets is they can be copied indefinitely. So I retain my copy and give you another copy. That doesn't work when you require scarcity value. And that's the magic trick that these distributed ledgers allow you to do. They have a lot of other benefits. So they can be used for the ownership of digital and physical assets. That's why digital rights management companies are doing a lot of work with distributed ledgers. They come in a variety of flavors. They can be open, like things like Bitcoin, where everybody can see what's on the ledger. In principle, they can't see who has that value on the ledger because they're supposed to be anonymous. In fact, they're not, which is a challenge. I don't think we're going to be seeing Bitcoin-style distributed ledgers within the energy sector for a range of reasons. There are public ones. There are also permissioned ones or private ones. So a permissioned blockchain or distributed ledger is one where the people who can see what's on that ledger have to sign up and be approved before they can do that. I think the reason why we will see that in the energy sector is we can now work out who has done what trades on these distributed ledgers. So if we're going to use these in energy, ultimately we are going to want to know the generation asset that sits behind a meter. And we are going to need to know for accounting purposes whether that somebody has hooked up a diesel genset behind a meter and is pumping energy onto the grid, or has a photovoltaic array behind there. We have to be able to account for the carbon content. As soon as we need to do that, we need to encode the MPAN of the meter into the blockchain. As soon as we do that, we break the UK Data Protection Act and the General Data Protection Regulations from the EU. In order to get around that, I think we will need to make these permissioned blockchain structures. So a bit of a diversion into some of the issues around blockchain. But also, as soon as we have permissioned structures, then all the concerns around the amount of energy that it takes to maintain one of these, and many of you will have heard of the notoriously large amount of energy it takes to maintain things like Bitcoin and all these Bitcoin miners, you strip out a huge amount of that. It doesn't take much energy to run a distributed ledger and a permission structure. So I think we're heading in that direction. The great benefit of these, particularly in the energy industry, is there are a lot of competing and mutually untrusting entities, particularly when you're getting new companies which are coming in and trying to set up and develop business models. They don't trust the incumbents in the sector. The good thing about a distributed ledger technology is the rules are completely open and transparent, and the system enforces the rules. So once you can see the rules, you can engage under an agreed and understood set of terms and conditions, if you like. They're also very cryptographically secure, so it allows for exchange of value. Other things to be worth being aware of is there are distributed ledgers of which a subset are what we call blockchains. So it's worth being aware that things like Ethereum, which is the best known of the blockchain structures, Hyperledger, these are blockchains, which are linear chains. There are other forms of distributed ledgers, particularly things like IOTA and Spectre, which are a completely different architecture and have some really good advantages for the sorts of work that we collectively do. So these use much less computational power. They are much better for running on sensing devices, and they secure the data using different cryptographic mechanisms. So one has to be aware that there are different flavors of these things. Why do you need these things? Well, we need, within a smart grid, and this is the direction the system is definitely evolving. We need infrastructure, as I said, that can be used by mutually competing and distrustful entities. We need some way to ensure integrity and authenticity, so we know if somebody says they've done something, we can actually independently authenticate that. It has to be able to deal with issues of commercial secrecy and customer privacy. We need a transaction layer that sits on top of that. If we want to balance the grid at the ends of it, we need to be able to both track energy demand up and down and in and out of batteries and in and out of PVs. But we also need to make sure that we can settle that financially very rapidly. Because the function currently that energy suppliers play in large measure is to mitigate counterparty risk between the wholesale market and the consumer. And the counterparty risk is imbalance and is credit risk. So if you can find a technology that addresses both the imbalance risk and the credit risk, and distributed ledgers offer mechanisms for doing that, they're not the only way of doing it, but they are a way of doing it, then you can strip out or disintermediate a lot of the costs and drive down the cost of energy for consumers. So we need a financial transaction layer that can do that. The other thing that distributed ledgers can do is they can in fact be an IoT control architecture. So you can actually use them to control digital or distributed energy assets on the system. And again, this is where I think non-intrusive load monitoring and distributed ledgers start to come together again, once we start breaking it down to the level of individual energy consuming assets and sensors within the system. So one of the areas that I'm most interested in and where I think there are most clear applications of the intersection of NILM digitization and distributed ledgers is in this area of peer-to-peer trading. So there are questions about how big this is going to get. Currently, we have a large number of, well, not a large number, around the world, there are quite a few people who are implementing this. As I said before, it's got Ofgem's attention, it's got BEI's attention. There are trials underway in the UK of how to deliver peer-to-peer energy trading. This is where effectively somebody producing energy and somebody consuming energy just trade it directly without any intermediary whatsoever. In order to do that, you need, again, to be able to understand this day-ahead predictability of energy. And that's where I think NILM can come in to build much higher resolution models of the expected demand arising from, of energy demand within small businesses and households. So to do peer-to-peer trading, you construct a balance group that might be sitting below a secondary or primary substation that you want to provide balancing services for. And you aggregate up the supply and demand and work out how much you either need to buy from the next level up in the network or how much surplus you will have to sell to that. That's the construction of a balance group. And there'll be some organization that sits in between the balance group and the wholesale market in most occasions, some kind of aggregator or retailer, that also provides some of the purposes of socializing imbalance and credit risk. But if you can minimize that risk, you minimize the overhead of that. And that's where I think NILM comes in as playing a crucial role. So if we can do that, we can do a whole lot of things that are in the network benefit. So we can do what the distribution system operators in the UK and globally are now doing, which is looking at distributed balancing services. You can start to look at something called social value stacking. So social value stacking is where you look at the range of reasons why individuals, either at the household or SME level, want to participate in things like peer-to-peer trading. And there's a lot of different value propositions which underlie there. So there's obviously the question of energy price, and where you have a differential between import and export, and that creates a financial incentive. A lot of the other areas are looking at autonomy. A lot of the uptake of this in Australia is about grid autonomy. In America, a lot of it is around environmental issues. There are local economic arguments where you might have a situation where you have a school who wants to install photovoltaic arrays. The school is shut over the summer for 6 weeks. That's the peak export time. So why would you install a PV on a school when there's nobody there to use that output of the PV? So then you arrange with your local co-op supermarket and you say, okay, we can export directly to you because they have peak consumption at that time. And they can understand their loads because they have very good models, which again can be done through disaggregation of when their demand is. So then you can do local energy trading, and then you can construct a value model where the supermarket is saying we are supporting our local school, and you start to get community value generated on the back of that. So there's a lot of things in this social value stack you can start to put together with these. There are challenges. As I said, the imbalance risk is one of the best ones, the best known ones that we need to address. The credit risks are another one, but I think these technologies and the very fine level of understanding of demand that's in there can help minimize those. There's also a whole lot of challenges around regulation. I spent a lot of my time talking with the regulator about how regulation, trying to understand where regulation may need to change to support these kind of models. To run through some of the organisations that you may have come across in this space, so of these, to give you a sense of how rapidly this area is moving, you can see the dates on there. So SolarCoin, which is one of the best known of these blockchain-based sort of exchanges of green energy, they are having a pre-sale that started on the 26th of October this year. And it's sort of that they are literally doing this now. The Power Ledger, which is a big one from Australia, they've just raised 34 million in pre-sale and main sale stages. So that closed, I think, about a month ago. Grid Plus is very interesting. Grid Plus is operating in Texas. They are actually installing in the home a device which is attempting, and my understanding is it's not doing this particularly well, but it's trying to effectively do this day-ahead prediction, but it's not including any NILM capacity in there. So their capacity for day-ahead prediction is ultimately limited by their capacity to understand how people are using energy and the social patterns behind that. But they are going to be on the 30th of October, so they've just started their main stage sale. So it's literally happening right now. And the biggest or the best known of all of these, LO3 Energy, which did the Brooklyn microgrid, it's now in the public domain, is going to be planning some kind of token generation event to raise funding for expansion, but they haven't started yet. So this is all unfolding literally as we speak. What's lying behind this, a lot of these organizations are using a platform called Ethereum. Ethereum has put us together a separate foundation called the Energy Web Foundation. And you can see the organizations which are supporting that. Also worth noting that Christoph Frey, who we met earlier, who is the person in charge of the World Energy Council, he is one of the founding board members. So you're starting to see how at the global level, there is a lot of buy-in and support for this range of technologies. So while there are debates around where this fits into the system, there is a lot of interest in trying to work out how it can fit in. There are challenges with these technologies. I'm not going to go through these in detail. These are well-known challenges in the field. I can talk questions about some of these things, but there are a lot of issues. The ones that I think are most concerning or the most challenging, potentially are ones around privacy, because a lot of people want public blockchains, but now clever cryptographers can work out who is doing what on these blockchains, and that's a real challenge. The other challenge is the general data protection regulations coming in through Europe. They have a right to be forgotten. How do you reconcile a right to be forgotten with an immutable ledger, which distributed ledgers are for? From an energy system perspective, the key challenges are around policy. As I said, we have constructed our entire policy and regulatory framework around one supplier per customer. The areas where this gets interesting and where a lot of big energy companies and small startups are really focusing on is how do we break that model? How do we end up with multiple suppliers per customer? And that's a fundamental challenge. And again, it's one of the ones that the head of Ofgem has actually flagged up as saying, we are aware of this, we need to think about how we might ultimately transition to one where there are multiple suppliers per customer. There are key consumer challenges. And I think the interesting area is, I think effectively this community should be owning the space between the meter and the customer. So I think that this community understands, or has the potential to understand, how and why people use energy better than any other community. And that's essential. And I think that's where